I'd always loved the woods. They were a place of peace and solitude for me. One weekend, I decided to take a solo camping trip to a forest I'd never visited before. I had read good things about it and wanted to explore its trails. After packing my gear and driving for several hours, I finally arrived at the trailhead. The parking lot was empty, and I felt a thrill of excitement at having the place to myself. The trail started off easy, winding through tall trees and lush undergrowth. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. I walked for a few hours, enjoying the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. I found a perfect spot to set up camp near a small stream. The water was clear and cool, and I felt confident about my choice. As evening approached, I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal. The crackling of the fire and the chirping of crickets filled the air. I felt completely at ease, surrounded by nature. As darkness fell, I climbed into my tent and settled in for the night. I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the steps were slow and deliberate, moving around my campsite. My heart started to race as I lay there, trying to convince myself it was nothing to worry about. The footsteps stopped right next to my tent, and I could hear heavy breathing. Fear gripped me. I lay still, listening intently. The breathing grew louder, and I could see a shadow moving through the thin fabric of my tent. The shadow circled my tent once, then twice. My mind raced with thoughts of who or what it could be. I had a knife in my backpack, but it was out of reach, and I didn't want to make any sudden movements. Suddenly, the shadow stopped at the entrance of my tent. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The zipper slowly began to open, and I felt a surge of panic. I knew I had to act. With a burst of adrenaline, I grabbed my flashlight and shone it directly at the figure outside. The light revealed a man, disheveled and wild-eyed. His clothes were dirty, and his face was twisted with an expression of anger and desperation. He looked like he had been living in the woods for a long time. For a moment, we stared at each other, both frozen in place. Then, without warning, the man turned and ran into the darkness. I listened as his footsteps faded away, my flashlight beam flickering in the night. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't believe what had just happened. I lay there for a few minutes, trying to calm down and decide what to do next. I knew I couldn't stay there. I quickly packed up my gear, my hands shaking. The fire had burned down to embers, and I used my flashlight to navigate through the dark woods. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting the man to return. Every sound made me jump, and my mind was filled with fear. I walked as fast as I could, heading back towards the trailhead. The forest, which had felt so peaceful during the day, now felt menacing and full of hidden dangers. The path seemed longer in the dark, and I kept losing my way, but eventually, I saw the faint outline of the parking lot through the trees. When I reached my car, I threw my gear into the back and jumped into the driver's seat. I locked the doors and took a moment to catch my breath. The sense of relief was overwhelming as I started the engine and drove away, leaving the forest behind. The next day, I reported the incident to the local authorities. They thanked me for the information and promised to investigate. I later learned that the man had been living in the woods for years, avoiding contact with people. He had never harmed anyone but had a history of scaring campers away. Despite the terrifying experience, I didn't let it ruin my love for the woods. I became more cautious and aware of my surroundings, always making sure to camp in safer, more populated areas. The forest still held its magic for me, but I never forgot that night and the lesson it taught me about the unexpected dangers that can lurk in even the most peaceful places. I'd been hiking the Appalachian Trail for several days, enjoying the solitude and serenity of the forest. The tall trees, the chirping birds, and the rustling leaves made me feel at peace. One night, I set up camp near a small clearing, away from the main trail. I liked being away from other people and felt it added to the adventure. As the sun set, I made a small fire, cooked my dinner, and watched the stars come out. The peaceful sounds of the forest gradually lulled me to sleep. I woke up abruptly to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but as I lay still, I could hear them clearly. They were slow and deliberate, crunching on the leaves just outside my tent. My heart started pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal passing by, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then the footsteps stopped right next to my tent, and I could hear the faint sound of breathing. I lay there, paralyzed with fear. My mind raced with thoughts of what or who it could be. The breathing grew louder, and I could feel my own breaths quickening in response. Then, the footsteps resumed, slowly circling my tent. I could see a shadowy figure through the thin fabric, moving methodically around me. My tent, which had felt like a safe haven moments before, now felt like a flimsy barrier between me and whatever was outside. The figure stopped again, right at the entrance of my tent. I held my breath, hoping it would just go away. But then I heard the zipper being slowly pulled down. In a flash of panic, I grabbed my flashlight and shone it directly at the figure. The light illuminated a man, disheveled and wild-eyed, staring back at me with a sinister smile. His clothes were dirty and torn, and his face looked twisted with an expression that sent chills down my spine. Without thinking, I screamed at the top of my lungs, hoping to scare him off or attract help. My voice echoed through the forest, and the man bolted into the darkness. I listened as his footsteps faded away, leaving me in silence once more. My heart was still racing, and I could hardly breathe. I lay there, clutching my flashlight, too afraid to move. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept the flashlight on, its weak beam my only comfort. I kept thinking about the man's sinister smile, and wondering why he was out there in the middle of nowhere. The hours dragged on, and I longed for the safety of daylight. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking, and I fumbled with my gear, but I managed to get everything together. I started hiking, moving as fast as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I hiked for hours without stopping, driven by fear and adrenaline. Eventually, I reached a more populated area of the trail and felt a little safer. I stopped to rest and eat, but I couldn't relax. The encounter had left me deeply shaken, and I knew I wouldn't feel at ease until I was far from that place. I never saw the man again, but the memory of his sinister smile still haunts me. Every time I go hiking, I think about that night and make sure to camp in safer, more populated areas. The forest, which once felt like a peaceful escape, now holds a darker, more menacing presence in my mind. My dad and I were camping at a remote campground with a lake nearby. The place was quiet and peaceful, perfect for a weekend getaway. One morning, we decided to hike through the forest to reach a waterfall we had heard about. We packed some snacks, grabbed our water bottles, and set off on the trail. The forest was thick with trees and the air was cool and fresh. We were excited to explore and see the waterfall. As we trekked through the dense woods, we talked and laughed, enjoying our time together. After walking for about an hour, we came across a strange sight, a large pile of branches and logs, known as a slash pile. On top of the pile was a small, worn-out child's shoe. It looked out of place and eerie, just sitting there. My dad and I exchanged uneasy glances, but we decided not to dwell on it and continued towards the waterfall. The trail was narrow and winding, and we had to navigate through thick underbrush. The sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves filled the air. After another hour of hiking, we finally reached the waterfall. It was beautiful, with water cascading down the rocks into a clear pool below. We sat on the rocks, had our snacks, and enjoyed the sight and sound of the rushing water. It was a perfect spot, and we felt relaxed. On our way back, we took the same path we had come. As we neared the area where we had seen the slash pile, we heard something strange. It was a child's voice, faint and distant, saying, "Hello? Is someone there?" My dad called out, "Hello? Are you lost?" But there was no response. We cautiously approached the clearing, but it was empty. There was no sign of anyone around. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a chill run down my spine. We decided to keep moving, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. As we walked, we couldn't shake the sensation that something was off. The forest, which had felt so welcoming earlier, now seemed darker and more menacing. We picked up our pace, eager to get back to our campsite. As we hurried through the woods, we started hearing rustling in the bushes and twigs snapping behind us. At first, we thought it might be an animal, but the sounds persisted, always just a few steps behind. My dad and I exchanged worried glances and quickened our pace even more. The sense of being followed grew stronger with each step. My heart pounded in my chest as we practically jogged through the forest. Every time we stopped to catch our breath, the sounds behind us would stop too. It felt like we were being watched, stalked by something unseen. We didn't speak much, just focused on getting back to our campsite as quickly as possible. When we finally emerged from the dense woods and saw the lake and our campsite ahead, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. We quickly made our way back to the campsite and sat down, trying to catch our breath and calm our nerves. We talked about what had happened and decided it was best to cut our trip short. We packed up our gear and left the campsite that afternoon, still shaken by the experience. As we drove away, I kept thinking about the child's shoe on the slash pile and the mysterious voice we had heard. It didn't make any sense, and the whole experience left me feeling uneasy. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in those woods, but I've never felt such an overwhelming sense of dread as I did that day. It was supposed to be a fun and relaxing camping trip, but it turned into something out of a nightmare. I haven't been back to that campground since, and I doubt I ever will. The memory of those sounds and that eerie shoe still haunts me. My wife and I were camping at Big Bend National Park in Texas. We loved the isolation and the beauty of the desert landscape. The wide open spaces, the rugged terrain, and the clear night skies were breathtaking. We set up our tent in a quiet spot, far from other campers, hoping to enjoy some peace and quiet. After a long day of hiking and exploring, we settled in for the night. We cooked dinner over a small campfire, talked about our adventures, and watched the stars. The sky was incredibly clear, and we could see millions of stars twinkling above us. It felt magical and serene, the perfect end to a perfect day. Around midnight, I was deep asleep when I felt my wife shaking me hard. I woke up, disoriented and confused. "There's something outside," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. I strained my ears and heard a faint rustling noise. At first, I thought it might be the wind or a small animal, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw the silhouette of a large animal lying on the ground just a few feet away from our tent. It was a cougar, its sleek body illuminated by the faint moonlight. The cougar was lying there, perfectly still, staring at us through the screen flap of our tent. Its eyes glowed eerily in the darkness, reflecting the faint light. My heart started pounding, and I felt a rush of adrenaline. We froze, too terrified to move. The cougar continued to watch us with its unblinking eyes. Minutes felt like hours, and we could hear our own hearts beating loudly in the silence. I knew that any sudden movement might provoke the cougar, so we stayed as still as possible. My wife clutched my arm tightly, and I could feel her trembling. The cougar eventually stood up slowly, its movements graceful and deliberate. It took a few steps closer to our tent, sniffing the air. I could see its muscles rippling under its tawny fur, and I knew we were in serious danger. We held our breath, hoping the cougar would lose interest and leave. After what felt like an eternity, the cougar turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. We stayed frozen for several more minutes, afraid it might come back. When we finally felt it was safe, we exhaled deeply, our bodies shaking with relief and fear. Neither of us could sleep after that. We lay there, wide awake, constantly listening for any sounds that might indicate the cougar's return. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig made us jump. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and we longed for the safety of daylight. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, we packed up our camp as quickly and quietly as we could. Our hands were still shaking, and we kept looking around nervously, expecting to see the cougar at any moment. We were both exhausted but determined to get out of there as fast as possible. We hiked back to the car, our eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of the cougar. Every shadow seemed threatening, and we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When we finally reached the car, we breathed a sigh of relief and quickly loaded our gear. Driving away from the campsite, we talked about the encounter, still trying to process what had happened. We knew we had been incredibly lucky. Cougars are powerful and unpredictable, and the situation could have ended much worse. The experience left us both deeply shaken. We had always loved camping and the sense of adventure it brought, but this encounter reminded us of the very real dangers that come with being in the wilderness. We decided to be more cautious in the future, choosing campsites closer to other people and making sure we were always aware of our surroundings. Even now, whenever we go camping, the memory of that night comes back. The image of the cougar's glowing eyes and its silent, watchful presence is something we'll never forget. It was a stark reminder of the unpredictable nature of the wild and the respect we must have for the creatures that live there.